Hey everybody, my guest today is Professor Erik Angner, and we're going to talk about how economics can save the world. Thank you so much for joining me.
Great to be here. Thank you, Jason.
Okay, so I am fascinated. How can economics save the world?
So the basic idea is that social and behavioral science broadly can give us important clues and important tools that will help us address the biggest problems that we're facing. What I noticed was that moving in circles with academics, economists, psychologists, other kind of behavioral scientists, I realized that there's a bunch of ideas out there, like real, practical, actionable ideas that aren't quite getting heard in the noise in social and traditional media. So you hear about the climate problem, for example, the climate crisis, and there's so many people talking about the severity of the problem. And then you have people sort of fighting against each other on along various frontiers. But when I talk to economists and when I look at the literature, economists are overwhelmingly agreed about what the solution has got to look like, or at least about some of the central components of a solution. And I felt like that positive message wasn't quite getting out.
Okay, it's funny because I was thinking about climate change when I read the title of your book, right? Because that is a common problem that people talk about. And I understood it as almost like a problem that was created by economics, but maybe the solution is just to change our economy and to change our economic policies to address it, right? So the reason why I was thinking that was because, well, maybe the problem with something like climate change is that companies and corporations are externalizing the costs, right? They're not forced to pay for cleanup. They're not forced to pay for like their carbon emissions. But if we just structure the policies in the right way, then we can address climate change. Is that what you're arguing?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that economics caused the problem, but the economy certainly did, right? I mean, we're facing such a big problem now because of economic activity, because we're living under an economic system that encourages in various ways the kind of harmful behavior that generates gases that then lead to climate change. And if you look at it as a fundamentally human problem, like without denying that there are molecules and things involved in the understanding of this, right? If you look at it as a sort of human problem, it becomes pretty obvious that the solution has got to work on humans as well, right? Whatever the solution is going to look like, it's going to involve human beings doing things differently from what we're doing now. And that's when you want to turn to a social science, I think, to look at, well, how did this happen? What are the structures and interactions that generated this kind of harmful behavior? And how can we toggle those things? Like, what are the levers available to us? And what can we do with those levers to solve the problem? In the case of climate change, like economists overwhelmingly believe that the solution takes the form of a carbon tax. So this is the way we deal with like alcohol and nicotine and things, right? We recognize that banning it completely, banning substances like that is impracticable, and like we've tried it and it didn't work, right? So we control it by means of a tax, and we ramp that tax up until we reach like a comfortable level of consumption. And the same idea is true for carbon in this model. So you impose a tax on the corporations that cause the problem, and then you crank it up until it's solved. I would add right away that like this is supposed to be used in combination with various other interventions, but this is thought of as like a central piece of the puzzle. And this has all sorts of appealing features. It allows people to burn coal and oil to some extent, right, when they must, but it makes the people who cause the problem pay for it. And it's going to cause innovation, right? It's going to encourage corporations to move away from the most harmful activities, and it's going to encourage consumers to consume more environmentally friendly goods and so on. And what I particularly like about this kind of solution is that it ought to be possible to organize a sort of coalition behind it. So conservatives, market liberals should like this because it preserves the role of the market with a price signal and so on. Christians ought to like it because it preserves the creation. You know, after all, we're here to take care of it. The green movement ought to like it because it's hitting the corporations where it hurts, right? And it's normally presented as in combination with a sort of lump sum payment where the money that the government takes in ought to be returned to the people in the country, all residents or all citizens of the country or whatever. And that means that if you don't have a very large carbon footprint, well, then you're going to come out richer with the tax than you would outside of it. So people on the left often feel like, well, a poor person who lives responsibly is going to end up richer than before. There's a distributional aspect to this. And I feel like we don't talk enough about the existence of solutions to many problems like this one and other ones. I'm not saying this is 100% certain to work. There are all sorts of ways in which it could break down. Implementing it is going to be hard. But hey, we have a suggestion here that the economics profession is largely behind, and why don't we give it a shot, right?
Okay, yeah, that sounds reasonable. So I'm trying to understand the relationship between economics, the free market, and the government and government intervention. Okay, so I see a tension between two different, philosophies, right? Those who are more eager, more willing for the government to intervene, right? And those who are more in favor of the free market. What you're proposing, something like a carbon tax, that's going to require government intervention. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's right. And this is basically the party line. I mean, if you pick up a textbook in microeconomics or something, what you'll find is like one part that talks about the ideal competitive market, what sort of things happen when you have an infinite number of consumers and no transaction costs and whatever. And you're going to learn about the various theorems that establish that in the presence of competitive markets, you can expect a Pareto optimal outcome. So there's an argument for the benefits of markets and defense of markets that in various ways goes back to Adam Smith and the idea of the invisible hand. But what you'll also get in a traditional, in any standard microeconomics textbook, is a discussion of market failure, the various scenarios where free, unregulated markets have failed to deliver optimal results on their own. And that is thought to provide a basis for interventions of various kinds. So the textbook will go on to talk about prohibitions, bans, mandates, price floors, price ceilings, that sort of thing. And very often it'll end up with an argument saying that Pigouvian taxes, meaning taxes on socially harmful or beneficial activities, is in many ways sort of a smart way to eliminate these market failures and increase social welfare. And the interesting thing to me, or one interesting thing about this kind of argument to me, is that this also goes back to Adam Smith. So Adam Smith had this picture of free markets. He was really concerned about government interference. He saw the opulence generated by trade, international trade and domestic trade, and he really wanted the government to be cautious about intervening in this wonderfully advanced, complex system that is, an economy. But at the same time, Adam Smith recognized the importance of personal virtue, not being a maximally selfish, greedy person, but seeing the benefits of sympathy, right? Feeling other people's pain and so on. And he was really, really concerned about corporations ganging up on consumers, forming guilds and clubs and organizations that could, if they worked, harm the consumer in the interest of the company owner or the capitalist or profiteer. So there is since the very beginning of economics, there's this tradition that emphasizes at the same time the wonderful power of markets and the various ways in which markets can fail to deliver. So in Adam Smith, certainly you didn't find that sort of mindless belief in the magic of free markets that you find in some of his fans. You got a relatively sophisticated picture of the various ways in which government intervention really could help the consumer and the public as a whole.
Okay, so those people who are free market supporters, do you think that they're just mistaken when they don't want government intervention and implementing some sort of carbon tax?
Oh, I don't know. I hesitate to speculate. But certainly there's a great deal of ignorance about the content of modern economics. And this is kind of interesting because what I see in some of the sort of simple-minded proponents of an economic approach to various social problems and what I see in critics of economics is a certain shared two-dimensional picture of what the science is about. So the actual science is a lot more sophisticated and a lot more multifaceted than you might think if you've read either, the most vigorous proponents or the most aggressive critics of the discipline. There are all sorts of scenarios, in fact, where economists recognize that free, unregulated markets won't just fix the problems on their own, but require some degree of intervention. There's a huge literature on institutions, for example, where institutions are sort of rules, norms, patterns within which we have to operate as individuals. And the thing about institutions is that they constrain behavior and consequently they constrain outcomes. So inside of a malfunctioning institution, when you and I act, rationally to the best of our ability with the very best intentions, the outcome can still be very, very bad for everyone involved. Whereas in a better, more functional institution, when you do your thing and I do mine, outcomes are much more likely to be conducive to the common good. And so this focus on institutions has a sort of similar upshot, which is that you can't just, if you're the government, step away from things and hope that everything will turn out for the best. Sometimes they will, right? There are scenarios where that happens, but sometimes that's not true. And you want to think about the various institutions that are in place. I think sort of an example of this is Russia after Glasnost and the fall of communism and so on, where a number of Western economists showed up in Russia, volunteering their services to sort of transform the country into a functioning liberal democracy. And what they advocated, some of these economists, was something they call shock therapy, which was a very quick transition to capitalism and democracy. And they wanted to privatize and deregulate. And they did so, but it didn't turn out very well, right? What in fact we saw was that a small number of people accumulated a very large share of the resources, and this is the rise of the oligarchs, and which ultimately led to the sort of criminal regime of Putin that we're seeing sort of right now. This is more akin to the robber barons of the past in the U.S. setting than a free market democracy. And what they said in their defense afterwards was that they did everything right, except for this one thing. They didn't reflect on the fact that Russia at the time didn't have a functioning legal framework. They didn't have courts, they didn't have police, they didn't have property rights. The people who owned property couldn't enforce their right to that property and so on. And of course, if you deregulate everything, hand out, massively valuable goods to people in the absence of a proper legal framework, well, then you should expect sort of robber barons to take over, right? So this sort of goes to illustrate the importance of paying attention to institutions as a prerequisite for functioning markets. And that's something that economists haven't always been attentive to, but it's something that we're seeing now more and more attention being directed to. There's an analogous literature on social norms that has a similar sort of upshot where social norms constrain individual behavior and consequently shape the outcomes that we will see. And what that means is that if you want to affect positive change, you can't just work on the individual. You might have to intervene on the norm itself.
So if the solution is, I guess, economically simple, it's a carbon tax, why hasn't that happened yet? Is it just because of political reasons? Like what's going on there?
Jason, I feel like this is above my pay grade. I know so little about the actual facts here. But of course, any kind of social change will have winners and losers. You can try when you design new institutions and so on to pay attention to this and try to compensate the losers. This is the thinking that underlies the lump sum payment, where people recognize that with the carbon tax, poor people who drive to work will get hurt, right? They're going to have to pay that tax. So you combine the tax with a sort of universal benefit that will offset the cost of that tax to those people. But there will always be some people who are worse off. And, in this case, it's the industry, right? The oil and gas industry and, associated businesses and whatever. And of course, they're opposed to this. There might be sort of other financial interests that are quite happy with the current arrangement, and they might do what they can to stop it, right? And so there's a fascinating sort of gap between what the economics profession is saying and the amount of pickup that you're getting among politicians, which is, really quite low still. And sometimes people think economists have too much sway, too much influence over politicians. But in this case, we're not seeing that at all. In fact, it would be better if economists had more sway over policy. But I think at a general level, other than, stories that might sound like conspiracy theories or whatever, social change is hard. It requires coordination. Like, I can't just change my life, turn my life around independently of you guys, and you can't turn your life around independently of me. Like, in so many ways, we have to act together. We need new infrastructure. We need new subsidies. We need new industries. We need innovation. We need investment in R&D and so on. And these things are going to have to happen as a result of like massive coordination. And in fairness, that kind of coordination is hard.
Makes me wonder if there have been carbon taxes that have implemented in other countries. Do you know?
Yeah, there have been in more limited geographical areas and in specific sectors. So in Sweden, for example, where I live in the 90s, there was a carbon tax on transportation. And what's nice about transportation is that you can't just outsource it to India, right? If there's no like carbon tax in India, because this is one of the concerns that producers will move the industry elsewhere to avoid the tax. And the experience here is that the tax really did reduce consumption of carbon-based fuels without hurting GDP. And so the general consensus among economists sort of looking at this kind of experience is that you can impose a relatively hefty fee on carbon without harming the economic development of the country. Now, the extrapolations that economists do could still fail, right? There's some chance that the reasoning is misguided, but there's a ton of evidence now, not just theoretical, but empirical, that shows that, at least on a smaller scale, these sorts of interventions seem to work well, and that gives economists confidence that this might work on a larger scale.
How do you prevent corporations from moving to evade the tax?
So that's a major concern for sure, right? The kind of proposal that economists have come up with comes with a tax at the border. So the thought is that if you import cars to the US that have been produced in a country without a carbon tax, those cars need to be hit with a special tax, a special import duty, to compensate for the fact that domestic producers have to pay that tax. And this kind of intervention has two benefits. One is that it equals the playing field, as it were. It doesn't make it profitable to move production of cars to a country that doesn't have this kind of tax. But it also encourages other countries to institute the same kind of tax. Because if you're Mexico and you get one of these kinds of taxes, then all of a sudden you can export to the US without paying the import duty. And that will then give an incentive to other countries to follow suit. Ideally, of course, you want to move as a bloc, you want to move together, a large group of countries. And doing that is a political problem that's obviously hard. But even if you can't move together with everybody else, you can, on a national level, especially if you're a big country like the US, institute one of these things without harming local business all too much.
Okay. So let's move on to another problem. What is another big problem that you think economics can solve?
Well, one of my favorite stories has to do with kidney donations. It's such an elegant solution. So the story here, the basic background is that we are in a screeching short supply of kidneys for donation. So lots and lots and lots of people have no functioning kidney. They would need a donation to live a life without dialysis and so on, but there aren't that many kidneys around. We recover kidneys from dead people, right? But the number of cadavers that we can use for these sorts of purposes is very low, and so it's not sufficient to cover the need. At the same time, there's a sense in which there's a glut of kidneys around, because most of us are born with two, and most of us only need one to live a perfectly good life. So most of us could donate a kidney and save somebody's life at, I don't want to say minimal cost, because there's some degree of discomfort and danger that comes with this, but nonetheless, it's possible to do that. And there are, in fact, lots of people who want to donate kidneys because they have a loved one who needs one, and so on. If your spouse or child or parent needs a kidney, you might be willing to donate one to give to them. However, it's not the case that any person can donate a kidney to any other person, because the two of you need to be compatible. And so there are plenty of people who want to donate and who need a kidney, who need a donation, who can't donate because they aren't compatible. And this is where the economics gets into the picture. So you need some sort of institution that brings people together and that allocates the kidneys in a way that makes sense from the point of view of the donors and the recipients, and that allows us to take advantage of all these different kidneys that are out there, in fact, and that could be donated. An economist called Al Roth, who was in fact my first economics professor, I think his fault that I'm here in some sense, devised a system that allowed you to do this. So if you have like two people over here who can't donate and two people over here who can't donate, it might nonetheless be true that you can donate like crosswise, that this donor could give a kidney to this recipient and this over here could give one to this one. So pairs can be arranged for this kind of, to solve this kind of problem. You can also have cycles where couple A donate a kidney to couple B, couple B to couple C, and couple C to A. And if you start off with a kidney donated without the expectation getting a kidney in return, you can set in motion a whole sequence or a chain of donations where one kidney donated freely can generate 30 or more donations. And so this has the additional benefit of increasing the incentive to donate. If you're considering donating one, not because there's somebody you know who wants one, but rather just out of the goodness of your heart, well then, knowing that by donating a kidney you can save not one person, but 30 or more, that might really put you over the edge, as it were. And this is being tested now for a number of years. Thousands, tens of thousands of lives have been saved in this way. And it's a great example of a situation where the free market can't just solve this. At least the free market can't solve it given our moral views about donations. So in most of the world, it's illegal to sell kidneys. You can't just put your kidney on eBay, no matter how much you want to get rid of it, right? For ethical reasons, we consider it unethical to sell and buy body parts in this way. And given that people feel that way, you need an institution that allows people to trade kidneys in this way to save lives without violating these ethical strictures. And what the economists did was that they fixed that problem. They built an institution, an algorithm, a marketplace where people can trade kidneys in a way that respects our ethical presuppositions.
Interesting. Okay, I wasn't sure exactly where you were going to go with this, part of the conversation. I first thought that you were going to advocate for the selling of kidneys. Right, that's what I thought you were going to say. But it sounds like what you're actually saying is that economics is almost like a tool to figure out and solve logistical problems, right? Just like, this person wants to donate but can't donate to this person. And so how do you get this kidney to this other person who needs it? And how do you get the other kidney to like this other person? So it's like a logistics issue. And then you're saying that economics gives us the tools to kind of figure that out. And once you actually figure out this type of system, it will encourage more people to donate out of the goodness of their hearts because it can save more lives because the system is so efficient.
Yeah. Logistics isn't everything that economists are doing, but in this case, you have a problem. There are certain parameters. This situation is inefficient because we have all these people who want to donate and who can't. And so what the economists are doing is sort of trying to fix the mismatch in such a way that everybody who wants to donate can do so while respecting, ethical strictures regulating these things in our culture.
Okay, but the people who are donating their organs, they're not doing it necessarily because they're expecting an organ back. Or like, let's say my loved one needs a kidney. I want to donate my kidney to her, but we're not a match. And so I need to donate my kidney to this kidney pool, this pool of kidneys, this trade pool, right? And then somebody else who is a match will donate their kidney to my loved one.
Yeah, so that gets it right, I think. So some people just donate out of the goodness of their heart, and they're called altruistic donors. Other people are willing to donate, but only if their loved one can get a kidney in return. So it's not necessarily going to be the case that the loved one is going to get your kidney, but you're willing to donate to somebody, anyone, provided your loved one can get one in return. That's a much more common scenario. Most of us don't just volunteer to donate kidneys, perhaps, sadly. And given those facts, what you need is some sort of environment, some sort of institution where people can, in fact, donate when they're willing to, while getting something in return, in the sense of a kidney for their loved one.
Interesting. This this makes me think of my mom, weirdly enough, because my mom used to work for a shipping company. And I would say for the most of my life, I did not understand what her job was. Even now, I don't really fully understand what she was doing. But she was explaining to me one day about like the logistical issues of like shipping companies, right? Because certain types of cargo require certain types of containers. And so you have all these different types of containers, and these containers are on these ships or in ports, and then they're distributed all throughout the world. And so you got to figure out what cargo needs what container and can get from point A to point B. Right. So that this huge like global web of like shipping stuff that you have to kind of coordinate. And then it just made me think of like these organs, like, oh, well, you have an organ over there in like Russia, right? And there are like certain like time constraints, and maybe you can only keep the organ alive for a certain amount of time. It has to be transported in a certain way, so it needs a particular container. So how do you get that to there and then get that over there? And it's like it's a very complicated issue. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So no, that's right.
So in regards to selling your organs, though, are you in favor of that?
No, I don't know. I don't think that would be a good idea necessarily, because of the risk for exploitation and people being pressured for economic and other reasons into donating when they don't want to. I think there's a real concern with autonomy and informed consent when so much is at stake. The point of this solution is that you might not need a market where people can buy and sell kidneys, because you can, in principle, fix these problems by means of like softer systems, softer ways of doing it. But at any rate, and this is a point that Al Roth has made quite effectively, I think, economists need to pay attention to people's values and treat them like constraints. If you operate in a society where people can't tolerate X, well, then your solution mustn't involve X, right? You have to think of a solution that respects not X and that operates within those constraints. And I guess this is something that economists haven't recognized quite so explicitly, but Roth has made a big deal out of this sort of the importance of economists paying attention to the values of the people they're working with. Something similar is true with other goods as well, like school choice. To some extent, it's a market. To some extent, you pay the highest bidder gets the slot. But with school choice, there are other concerns as well, and there are other values at stake, to be honest. We might want schools to be equalizers in a sense that they give kids with whichever background a shot at an education and a better future and so on. And if that's true, then a pure market solution might not take you there. So this is another way in which economic analysis and economic solutions have to pay attention to values. We need to be attentive to what we're looking for. What kind of outcome would we be happy with? What do we want to see? And then reflect on what mechanism is most likely to take us there. Maybe a pure free market with freely floating prices is exactly what we need to get to the goal we want to get to. And so great. But if we're talking about goods where that's not true, where other values are at stake, well, then there might be other solutions that are more responsive to those sorts of values and in that respect better.
This conversation highlights my ignorance of economics, and perhaps I have certain like stereotypes of economists, because like when I hear economics, just the word economics, I think free market. When I hear the word economist, I think, oh, this person supports free markets. So when I read the title of your book, How Economics Can Save the World, I understood it as how the free market can save the world, right? So maybe it'll be helpful for me to just to take like one step back, right? Like, how would you define economics?
So economics is really the study of human choices, of the decisions that we may make in situations where something is at stake, where choosing something requires you to give something else up. So economists talk about choice under scarcity, which just means that we're talking about situations where there's less of stuff around than we would want. So economics is the study of that, and also the consequences of those choices for society as a whole. So this means economics covers financial choices. How much money are you going to spend on food? How much are you going to spend on leisure, whatever? How much is the government going to spend on the army? How much is it going to spend on healthcare? Those are clearly economic topics. But economics is wide enough to incorporate concerns about time, like how do we spend our time, and all sorts of other things, like what are the happiness implications of our choices, and so on. The connection with free markets, I think, is there. It's not a pure like figment of your imagination or whatever, because many economists operate with a conception of welfare that says that you're well off to the extent that your preferences are satisfied. How do we help you, Jason, to satisfy your preferences? Well, under a wide range of conditions, we allow you to make your own choices because you know what your preferences are, certainly more than I do. You know what's available to you and whatever. So given that conception of welfare, there's a prima facie reason to trust your choices. And if there's a market and I have something that I don't want, but you have something that I want and you want the thing that I have, well, then we can trade with each other and we can enhance our welfare because this isn't a zero-sum game. And so by extension then, in a market-based society where people can make their own choices, they can all pursue their own good in the way that they think is most suitable. And over time, then, you would expect welfare to increase. So there is, like at a fundamental level, an argument for free markets, free choices, free movement for labor as well as, consumer goods and so on. And economists, like by and large, are agreed that markets are a wonderful mechanism for solving at least some problems of distribution and so on. But then there's a sort of political philosophy, right, that says that we ought to organize society in such a way that we use free markets to allocate the distribution of all goods to the greatest extent possible, and where the government should be like absolutely minimal. And there are people who believe that. Some of them are economists. But those are, if you drew the Venn diagram, you would find relatively few people in the intersection. In the US, if you ask economists what their political views are, they are on the mean somewhere sort of center left. They describe themselves as left of center. And I think part of what that reflects is that economists know that you can be in favor of like free markets or relatively free markets at the same time as you're in favor of redistribution. You can have a government that like takes from the rich and gives to the poor, that punishes corporations that cause massive damage, give the money to the people who suffer the injuries and so on. And that's sort of compatible with the picture that I painted of a functioning market. So the modal economist sort of sees both of these things. Now, economics has like a PR problem. And I think you're not the only one to have those sorts of associations. And my guess is that the economists that you see on television, the people who get trotted out as economists, don't in general represent the science of economics, the academic discipline of economics. Very often they're employed by think tanks where their job is not to necessarily tell you what to think, but to push a particular agenda or to, reinforce a certain view of some kind. Then you have people who come from business schools who might be professors of marketing or finance or something, which are legit disciplines, right? But they're quite different from economics. And then you have like the total charlatans and cranks who sometimes pop up in the media sort of talking economics, right? I don't want to mention any names, but you can probably think of some characters, right? And I think the reason why they're so visible is that they make for good television. If you're a TV producer and you're putting on a panel debate or something, you don't want somebody who says, like, on the one hand this, on the other hand that. You want somebody who's going to come out swinging, and that often means that you'll end up with somebody less serious than they should be and more, extreme in their views than they ought to be. And so economics has like a PR problem, a marketing problem. And as a result of this, I think there's a limited trust, right? People in general don't trust economists. They don't think economists know what they're doing. They think they're hired guns to a greater extent than they probably are. Maybe I'm making the problem worse by, talking about them in this way. But this matters to me because when it comes to science communication, when it comes to sort of encouraging people to listen to the science, one thing that we've learned through studies on this and throughout the pandemic and whatever, that trust is like absolutely critical. So part of what I would like to do, and one of the changes that would really make a big difference, is enhancing trust. But that's going to involve weeding out some of the less serious people.
So the way that you understand economics and like the study of how people make choices in a context of scarcity, maybe something like that, that would apply to the dating market as well, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So it's quite broad. Okay.
Yeah. No, it's very, the matching markets is the general term. Al Roth, who worked on the organ donation schemes, has worked on models like that as well. So how you find a match. Organs and marriage and dating have this in common, that you can't just like go out in the market and purchase a unit of, a partner the way you can a unit of like whiskey or something, right? The other person on the other side of the trade has to consent to the trade or the match taking place. And this makes for an interesting economics that has a different character from the standard like competitive market stuff that you get at the beginning of an, intro to microeconomics course. But this is absolutely economics. Has massive economic consequences. Raising children, right? Massive economic consequences. It's also about choice under scarcity. You're a parent, you only have so much time, right? You only have so much money. You want your kids to survive, flourish. You also want to remain sane. How are you supposed to strike the best balance between those things? Well, classic economic problem.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, well, let's take on another problem. What is another big issue that you think economics can solve?
So let me talk about overconfidence, which is one of my favorite topics, really. Overconfidence has been called the mother of all biases. And what I mean by overconfidence is like an excessive confidence in your own knowledge or your abilities. Why is it such a big problem? Well, if you think about all the other problems that we suffer, a lack of knowledge, logical fallacies, statistical misrepresentations and whatever, these sort of problems wouldn't necessarily cause any trouble. They wouldn't be bad for us if it weren't for the fact that we're so often unaware of the fact that we have those misconceptions and that we're committing those fallacies and so on, right? If you ask me to defuse a nuclear bomb, like I wouldn't do it because I know I wouldn't be able to. But in all sorts of other contexts, I think that I can do stuff that I can't. And so in that sense, like overconfidence is a sort of force multiplier. If you have any problem or limitation at all in the presence of overconfidence, the damage is going to be so much larger. The trouble you can get into potentially is so much worse. This is something that has been studied for more than half a century. There's a ton of research on this that shows that overconfidence is widespread. Everybody has it, at least some of the time, in many domains. It's also remarkably resilient. So if you tell people about overconfidence, if you inform them that this is a problem, that has like zero effect on what's ultimately going to happen, right? What you might say to yourself is, yeah, people have that problem, but I don't, right? I think many people recognize this. If you ask somebody like, are you quite sure of what you just said? People will very often fire back saying, yeah, of course I'm sure. Like, otherwise I wouldn't say it. But if you ask them, like, are other people sometimes misguided? People will say, God, yes, other people are misguided. And in fact, it's true that if you ask people on the whole, like, are you sometimes misguided? Are you sometimes overconfident? People will say, yeah, on the whole, it happens that I'm overconfident. But then you ask like about the specific claim they just made, and then they will insist that they're absolutely sure that that's true. So overconfidence is widespread and resilient, and it's kind of hard to get to. But research has identified like a couple of different things that you can do to reduce the level of overconfidence that you display. And my favorite intervention is this. It's to ask yourself, what reason are there that I might be wrong? Such a simple question. Like, what reasons are there that I might be wrong? Under what circumstances will my prediction turn out to be false? That sort of thing. But it works because we are much more used to reflecting on reasons why we're right. Think about a conversational topic. If you and I have a beer and I say something, I say something about who's going to win the next election, you might say, plausibly, what makes you think so? Like, what's your evidence or something? And anticipating this, I'm going to rehearse various reasons why I'm right so that I'm prepared, right? So that I'm armored when you ask. But when everybody does this all the time or much of the time, we go around rehearsing reasons why we're right. We end up sort of overestimating the probability that we're right. Because in my head, the only reasons I hear are reasons why I'm right. And in your head, the only reasons you hear are the reasons that you're right. And you can sort of undercut that process or counteract that process by forcing yourself to think of scenarios where your predictions turn out to be false. It's hard in a sense. It doesn't come naturally to us, but it's really quite helpful sometimes. And it isn't that hard once you get the hang of it to ask yourself these sorts of questions. Don Moore, who's written a book on overconfidence, encourages you to think about what the people who disagree with you would say. So, for example, like if you're about to buy stock, right, you think an airline is the investment to make right now, like you're going to invest in United Airlines or something. You might have lots of reasons to think that the stock is going to appreciate over time, but somebody is selling that stock to you. Who is that person going to be? Well, overwhelmingly, it's going to be an institutional investor. It's going to be a professional with experience, training, computer systems, right? A whole profession backing them up. And presumably, they've given some thought to this. And if they think it's time to sell, that should give you an indication that not necessarily that you're wrong, but nonetheless that you shouldn't be too confident in your judgment. And so just by asking, like, what does the seller think? Like, why would somebody sell right now when I think buying is a no-brainer? Well, that can have the same effect of sort of encouraging you to think about reasons why you're wrong, and as a result, to then lower your level of overconfidence. You can do this in a social setting as well. If you're a team leader or a manager, or you're in a philosophy seminar, right? You can ask the speaker, what makes you say what you just said, and under what circumstances would you be wrong? You can model this kind of behavior by immediately confessing that you're wrong when you realize, rather than, fighting a trench warfare the way some people do. In certain contexts, this is hard. So there are examples like Elon Musk firing people on the spot on Twitter when an employee of the organization tells him that he's wrong. Right? Some people won't tolerate anyone even mentioning the possibility. But what we ought to be doing, if we want to reduce the level of overconfidence that we exhibit and be more calibrated, is to welcome that kind of criticism, right? If you as a friend tells me, hey, Erik, I think you're excessively confident there because think about this and that, well, then I ought to encourage you to do that, right? I ought to thank you for giving me reasons that I'm wrong. And this can take a little while to change if you operate in a culture where it's not already the norm, but it's doable. It's free, right? You can start right this second to think in these terms. Might I be wrong? Yes, I might be wrong, right? I'm basing what I say on like more than 50 years of research. It's pretty unanimous, like what the upshot is. But I think nonetheless that the evidence gives us good reason to think that this is how overconfidence works.
Okay, so this reminds me again that I am very ignorant of economics, because I don't even understand how this was an economic issue and how economics was the tool for to help us solve overconfidence.
So one thing about, or two things about economics is that it's become much broader than it used to be. There's a time lag, I think, in what an actual profession is doing and what the public perception of the discipline is, right? And in the case of economics, it's changed quite quickly as a result of developments like behavioral economics, which incorporates behavior, mental states, limitations in cognitive performance, and things like that. The other thing about economics, and maybe academia in general, is that it's become a lot more interdisciplinary. So there's a sense in which any distinction that you draw now between economics and political science or economics and psychology is more or less arbitrary, because so much of the most recent work, so much of the more interesting work is done in interdisciplinary teams where you have an economist, a political scientist, a psychologist, maybe a philosopher even, right, doing this work together. And then, at the end of the day, is it really economics or is it really psychology? Well, who cares, right? It really doesn't matter if it's the one or the other. But the point here is that economics offers a sort of distinctive way to think about the world that can be used on its own or that can be combined with other disciplines to good effect. And I'm not interested in like policing boundaries at all. I just want to underscore what a systematic application of these sorts of ideas and tools can help us do, because it really is quite remarkable. And because so many people don't know what economists are up to, they can't know what the solution looks like, right? They have no reason to trust whatever the solution is if they come across it and whatever. And it's a shame, because there are so many useful ideas that could be implemented like today in communities across the country, in corporations, in organizations, in universities that just never, have any effect.
I wonder if there is some sort of analogy to be made with, I guess, the production of material goods, right? So perhaps before there were more individual makers and producers of things that would produce the thing from beginning until finish, right? And then we have division of labor, and that becomes much more efficient. And then we can all kind of work together to make something like, when Milton Friedman talks about like a pencil, a number 2 pencil, right? It's amazing that we can all work together to make something like a pencil, okay? And of course, we have advanced technologies that require thousands, tens of thousands of people working together, right? So that's just, us manufacturing things. Perhaps knowledge should be like that as well, right? So instead of thinking, well, economists work on this, psychologists work on this, and philosophers work on this, maybe the future of it is interdisciplinary, so that we can all work together to produce knowledge and advanced knowledge that we otherwise wouldn't be able to produce.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's a fact that academia in particular is getting more specialized. So the different disciplines don't really talk to each other. They're all like involved in their own little projects. And in fact, every like academic discipline now has disciplines and subdisciplines where people barely talk to each other. So there are very few people, I understand, who have like a bird's eye view of what's going on in like neuroscience, for example, right? There's so many people working on this. And superficially, that's a good thing, right? Because division of labor, if all of us tried to do everything at once, the result would be very superficial, right? It probably wouldn't even be worth doing. So division of labor is good. But the story about division of labor is the story of something that works because there's trade, right? That's how Adam Smith's baker and cobbler, get bread and shoes, right? Just because they trade with each other. And what we're seeing now is a situation where people don't talk to each other. So I've spent a lot of time doing work on well-being, right? Which is a topic where arguably philosophers, psychologists, economists, epidemiologists are all working on the same thing. But they don't read each other. They don't even know there's work in some of these disciplines in many cases. And that's definitely harmful. Now, how do we overcome this? Well, there are people who can do like two things at the same time. I've tried to be, as good a philosopher as I am an economist, and the other way around. In many cases, that's just not going to be doable. And so the solution then is going to have to be to address topics in teams, to form research groups where individuals come from different perspectives, try to address some problem together, try to conceptualize what the problem is, diagnose it, come up with solutions, and so on. And we're certainly seeing a fair amount of this. During the COVID crisis, there wasn't enough maybe of this, but nonetheless, people were talking to each other to some extent across these boundaries. And I think that reflected a realization that like having an understanding of the origin of the disease is great, but it's not enough to fix it, right? Having a vaccine is wonderful, but even having a vaccine is not enough to fix the problem, because you need to get the vaccine into the hands of the people who need it. And, you have to do that by means of informed consent, which means that people have to understand what they're doing and whatever. And a breakdown like anywhere in this chain will lead to people not getting vaccinated and the problem not being solved. And you can only fix like big problems like this if you're willing to address them from multiple perspectives at once. And I think this is true for basically every major challenge. Like I can't think of a single like major challenge that doesn't have like economic aspects, philosophical aspects, political aspects. And that suggests to me that if we want to solve these problems, we've got to address them simultaneously from different perspectives and then try to cobble together a solution that respects the constraints imposed by these different perspectives or aspects.
So what's a problem that you think economics cannot solve?
Cannot solve? Well, on its own, I don't think economics can solve anything, to be honest, right? Any solution that economists come up with has got to reflect not just an understanding of the economic realities, but it's also got to reflect some kind of values that we're willing to endorse. And those values have got to come from somewhere, and they can't come from systematic empirical study, economic or otherwise. And so in order to combine the economic or technical expertise of the social scientist, we need to combine that in order to take advantage of the technical economic expertise. That expertise needs to be coupled with expertise in normative matters, for example, and that's going to require some degree of philosophical reflection. It doesn't mean necessarily that we need professional philosophers everywhere, but it does need that some willingness to engage with reasons for and against various values and various normative commitments are going to be critical. So in a way, I don't think economics on its own can't fix anything. But if we combine it with other kinds of knowledge, other forms of reflection, we can do a whole lot of good.
You come off as optimistic.
Yeah, good. But I'll tell you that this is, to some extent, it's been a struggle. I'm Gen X, right? And of course, people don't think of us at all. But to the extent they think of us, we were associated with cynicism and whatever, right? I'm fluent in cynicism. But I've also come to think that that kind of attitude, that kind of cynicism is part of the problem, right? We can't sit around here and look at the climate crisis and persistent poverty and discrimination and warfare and so on and just say to ourselves, yeah, that's human nature. Because that's harmful, right? That doesn't do any good and might in fact do real harm. And so I think we have a certain duty to be hopeful, to be optimistic. And I reconcile that by saying to myself that you can think of optimism in different ways. You can think of it as sort of a naive notion that everything will be fine no matter what. And of course, in that sense, we can't be optimists, right? We shouldn't be optimists. But you can think of optimism as a judgment to the effect that things can be better if we apply ourselves in combination with a commitment to make sure that they do. And in that sense, I think optimism is rational and evidence-based and something of a moral duty, right? And an attitude that we need to nurture. It's a virtue rather than a naive conception of some kind. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, but nonetheless, I feel like we owe it to ourselves and to others to try, right? And to the extent that some degree of optimism and hope is a prerequisite for trying to fix the big challenges, we just gotta nurture that.
I think that's a good place to wrap things up. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Jason. It's a pleasure.